War is often defined by its weapons, but it is won by its systems. In the mid-20th century, the German Wehrmacht deployed a revolutionary system of combined arms, the Blitzkrieg, that brought Europe to its knees. Its panzers and Stukas became symbols of a new, terrifying speed of warfare. In response, the United States, a nation rearming in haste, would perfect a system of its own. It was not as glamorous as a tank or a fighter plane, but it would become the single most feared component of the Allied arsenal. The Germans would come to dread it, giving it names that spoke of sheer terror. Achtung-Artillerie, the Iron Rain. This is the story of the American artillery system of the Second World War. It is the story of a revolution in technology, mathematics, and doctrine that allowed hundreds of guns, miles apart, to bring down a sudden, unified, an inescapable storm of steel on a single point. The Germans, when they faced it, were overwhelmed by what amounted to instant thunder. This was the doctrine of time on target. Asterisk, to understand the revolution, one must first understand the stagnation. When the United States entered the Second World War, its artillery doctrine was, in essence, a relic. It was a doctrine born in the mud and stalemate of the Western Front, dominated entirely by the experience and equipment of its World War I allies, particularly the French Dot, the American Expeditionary Forces. In 1917 and 1918 were a junior partner. They were equipped largely with French and British guns. The preeminent field piece was the French 75 mm, a fine, quick-firing gun, but one designed for a different era. The heavy lifting was done by the 155 mm GPF, or Grande Puissance Fillouille French design that would, incredibly, remain the standard heavy gun for the U.S. Army until 1942. The entire American artillery philosophy, from the highest echelons down to the gun crews, was imported wholesale from the French school. This French doctrine was rigid, methodical, and obsessed with preparation. It was built for a static war on attrition. An attack was preceded not by surprise, but by an overwhelming, days-long bombardment. This preparation fire, as it was known, was designed to systematically destroy barbed wire, collapse trenches, and silence enemy batteries. It was a process of industrial annihilation, and it was slow. It telegraphed every offensive, giving the enemy ample time to move reserves and prepare for the inevitable infantry assault. Surprise was impossible. Mobility was an afterthought. In the interwar years, this thinking calcified. The U.S. Army, starved of funds by the National Defense Act of 1920, had neither the money nor the inclination to innovate. The field artillery remained a branch dominated by tradition. Horses were still the prime movers for most units, a fact that severely limited tactical mobility. The curriculum at the Field Artillery School at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, while excellent in the fundamentals of gunnery, was still teaching the WWI, methodical battle. The core of the problem was a lack of centralization. In the 1920s and 30s, an artillery battalion was little more than an administrative grouping of independent batteries. Each battery, typically 4 guns, was expected to find its own targets, establish its own observation post, and calculate its own firing data. A battalion commander could request that his batteries fire on a single target, but the process was a clumsy affair of concentration, not unified fire. The batteries would fire sequentially, or as close together as their individual calculations would allow. The effect was a rolling barrage, not a simultaneous strike. The enemy would hear the first shell, and by the time the last battery's rounds landed, they would be deep in their bunkers. Meanwhile, Germany was developing a new philosophy. The theories of Guderian and his contemporaries placed emphasis on movement, surprise, and the integration of air power, armor, and infantry. Their artillery was designed to be mobile, to keep up with the panzers, and to provide immediate, on-call fire to eliminate strong points. They were developing a system for a 60-mile-an-hour war. While the U.S. was still training for a 3-mile-an-hour war, the Lassiter Board of 1919, a post-war commission led by Major General William Lassiter, had actually identified many of these shortcomings. The board's report was a sweeping critique calling for motorization, improved communications, and the development of new, more mobile howitzers. It was a blueprint for the future, and it was almost completely ignored. The Army favored investing in massive, 14-inch railway guns weapons of a static siege. Not a war of movement. This technological and doctrinal stagnation was dangerous, but invisible during peacetime. The Field Artillery Journal of the 1930s is filled with debates on horse-packing techniques and the finer points of observed fire by a single battery. There was little discussion of how to mass the fires of an entire division, let alone a corps onto a single target with split-second timing. The wake-up call came in May 1940. The fall of France in 6 weeks was a doctrinal earthquake. The French system, the very one the US had adopted, had been shattered by the German system of Blitzkrieg. It was a humiliating and terrifying proof that the old way of war was dead. This shock forced the hand of U.S. Army leadership. General George C. Marshall, the Chief of Staff, and Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, head of Army Ground Forces, began a root-and-branch reform of the entire U.S. Army. McNair, in particular, was a ruthless pragmatist. He was an artilleryman by trade, but he had no patience for the old, slow traditions. He wanted an army that was light, mobile, standardized, and lethal. He pushed for the triangular division, a new, more flexible structure of 3 infantry regiments, which replaced the old square division of World War I. This new, fast-moving division needed a new kind of artillery. It needed artillery that could move with the tanks and infantry, which meant motorization and self-propelled guns. It needed artillery that could react instantly to calls for fire from the front, which meant revolutionary new communication systems. And it needed artillery that could overwhelm the enemy with a sudden, shocking concentration of firepower, which meant a new way of calculating and controlling fire. The problem was clear. In 1940, the U.S. Army possessed an artillery branch that was horse-drawn, procedurally outdated, and philosophically stuck in 1918. It was preparing to fight a 1940s war with a 1920s mindset. The WWI doctrine of preparation fire was useless for exploitation warfare. To support the kind of rapid, combined arms maneuver that the new war demanded, the U.S. field artillery would have to reinvent itself from the ground up. It would need new guns, new organizations, and most importantly, new ideas. The 1918 era, battery-centric method of observed fire had to be replaced by a 1940s era, battalion-centric system of commanded fire. And it was this shift, from independent batteries to a centrally controlled network, that would pave the way for the single most important tactical innovation of the war: time on target. The old, dead hand of the Great War was finally being pried loose, and a new queen of battle was about to be forged. The German concept of Blitzkrieg was a system built on speed and integration. The American response would be a system built on industrial production, standardization, and communication, to create the instant thunder effect that would later characterize commanders like Omar Bradley. The U.S. Army first had to build the tools. This was not just about building better guns. It was about building a holistic system of steel, mathematics, and electronics. This system had 3 core components: the eyes, the brains, and the steel. First, the steel, the guns themselves. The old French 75s and 155 mm GPFs were retired. In their place came a standardized, modern, and exceptionally effective family of weapons. The workhorse, the gun that would define American fire support, was the M2 105 mm howitzer, later redesignated the M101. It was not a revolutionary weapon, but it was a masterpiece of industrial design. It was reliable, accurate, and mobile. It fired a 33-pound high-explosive He shell out to a range of over 11,000 meters, or about 7 miles. Its high-angle fire, as a howitzer rather than a flat trajectory gun, was perfect for hitting targets behind hills and in trenches. For heavier work, there was the M1 155 mm howitzer. It threw a 95-pound shell over 9 miles. And for long-range, course-level, counter-battery fire, there was the M1 155 mm long tom gun, a fearsome weapon that could hurl a 95-pound shell nearly 15 miles accurately. But the real innovation was not just the towed guns. It was motorization. The Army embraced self-propelled artillery. The most famous was the M7 Priest, which mounted a 105 mm howitzer on the chassis of an M3 tank. This was Leslie McNair's vision made real. For the first time, the artillery could keep up with the tanks. It could shoot and scoot, firing a mission and then moving before the enemy could retaliate. This mobility was a force multiplier, allowing a single battery to support an advance across miles of territory. Second, the eyes, the observation network. A gun is useless if it cannot see its target. The U.S. Army's solution was multi-layered. On the ground, you had the forward observer, or FOE. This was typically a young lieutenant who traveled with the frontline infantry or tank units. His job was to be the eyes of the guns, miles to the rear. His most important tool was not his binoculars, but his radio. The U.S. developed a suite of rugged, dependable, and, for the time, lightweight radios. The -300 Seychelles rupees walkie-talkie was a 35-pound backpack FM radio that became the standard for FOs. It allowed for clear, instant voice communication from the front line directly to the brains of the operation. This was a quantum leap. The Germans, while pioneers in radio for their tanks, were far behind in their artillery communication. They still relied heavily on field telephones, a system that was slow to lay, easy to cut with shellfire, and completely unsuited for a war of movement. The eyes weren't just on the ground. The U.S. Army perfected the use of air observation posts, or air ops. These were nothing more than tiny, unarmored Piper L-4 Grasshopper aircraft. Flown by artillery officers, these Maytag Messerschmitts would circle slowly over the battlefield, able to see deep behind enemy lines. With their radios, they could spot German tank formations, supply dumps, or hidden batteries, and call down the wrath of an entire corps of artillery. The Germans, with their air superiority waning, had no effective answer to this. Finally, and most importantly, there was the brains, the Fire Direction Center, or FDC. This was the true revolution. The FDC, a small team of highly trained specialists, located at the battalion headquarters, was the central nervous system of the new artillery. In the old WWI system, each gun captain did his own calculations. In the new American system, the guns became dumb platforms. The gun crews were trained only to set the azimuth, left-right, and quadrant, up-down, data that was sent to them, and to load the shell and propellant charge they were told to use. All the mathematics was centralized in the FDC. This team, working in the back of a truck or a cramped dugout, was a human analog computer. When the foe on the front line radioed in a target, he didn't give firing commands. He gave map coordinates. The FDC team would then perform a complex series of calculations. Using their M1 plotting board, a circular map of the battlefield, and their M1 logarithmic slide rules, they would calculate the precise firing solution. They didn't just calculate the range and direction. They corrected for variables: the air temperature, the barometric pressure, the wind speed and direction, data provided by weather balloons, the individual muzzle velocity of each gun, and even the rotation of the Earth, or the Coriolis effect, on long-range shots. This system accomplished two things. First, it was fast. An FO's call could be translated into steel on target in under 2 minutes. Second, it allowed for mass. The FDC didn't just control one battery. It controlled all the batteries in the battalion, typically 12 or 18 guns. And the battalion FDC was networked with the divisional FDC, which could, in turn, command all the artillery in the division, which might be over 70 guns. This scaling could go all the way up to the corps level. This was the American system, standardized. Excellent guns. A networked system of eyes on the ground and in the air, using reliable radios. And a centralized brain in the FDC that performed all the calculations. This ecosystem was purpose-built to solve a single problem: how to bring the maximum amount of firepower to bear on a single point in the minimum amount of time. One last piece of technology, kept top secret, completed the package: the VT, or Variable Time Proximity Fuse. This was a tiny radar set built into the nose of a shell. Instead of exploding on impact, where much of the shrapnel is absorbed by the ground, or with a timer, which is difficult to set correctly, the VT fuse detected the ground and detonated. The shell at a preset altitude, typically 20 to 30 meters. This airburst effect was devastating against troops in the open or in foxholes. It rained shrapnel down on them, bypassing the protection of their cover. When introduced in late 1944, it multiplied the lethality of American artillery tenfold. With these tools, the guns, the radios, the FDCs, and the VT fuse, the stage was set. The U.S. Army had built a machine. Now it had to perfect the doctrine that would make it sing. Having the hardware, the guns, the radios, the FDCS was only half the battle. The other half was the software, the doctrine, the process, and the training. The revolutionary doctrine that emerged from the Field Artillery School at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, was known as Time on Target, or TOT. Time on Target is a simple concept with a profoundly complex execution. The definition is precise: the simultaneous arrival of the first rounds from multiple firing units onto a single target dot in the old system. If a battalion of 3 batteries wanted to hit a target, the commander would give the order, and all 12 guns would fire at roughly the same time. But the batteries were not in the same location. Able Battery might be 8,000 meters from the target. Baker Battery might be 9,500 meters away. Charlie Battery might be 7,000 meters away. Even firing at the same instant, their shells would have different times of flight, TOF. The shells from Charlie Battery would land first, then Abel's, then Baker's. The effect would be a rolling barrage, a siren, siren, siren sound. This gave the enemy seconds, precious seconds, to dive for cover after the first explosion. Time on Target inverted this entire process. The goal was no longer to fire at the same time, but to land at the same time. This turned the process from a simple command into a complex mathematical problem, a problem that only the new FDC system could solve. Let's walk through the procedure. An air op, a grasshopper pilot, spots a column of German trucks pulling into a village square. He radios the coordinates of the square to the division. Artillery, Devardi FDC. The Devardi FDC decides this target is worthy of a major. Strike and assigns 3 battalions of 105 millimeters. Howitzers to the mission. That's 54 guns in total. The command goes out over the radio network. Mission: Time on Target. The time on target itself the moment of impact, is set. The Devardi FDC declares, time on target, 14 hours 30 minutes and 0 seconds. This is the A hour. Every FDC in all 3 battalions synchronizes their watches. Now the real work begins. The FDC in each of the 3 battalions, let's call them Battalion 1, 2, and 3 gets to work. Battalion 1 is the farthest away. Its FDC plots its own position and the target's coordinates. Using their firing tables, they calculate that from their location, using a specific propellant charge, their shells will have a time of flight, TOF, of 42 seconds. Battalion 2 is closer. Its FDC runs its own calculations. Their TOF is 31 seconds. Battalion 3 is firing from a different angle. Their TOF is 36 seconds. Now the FDCs do the critical calculation. They take the AR, 14 hours 30 minutes and 0 seconds, and subtract their unique time of flight. The FDC for Battalion 1 issues its command, time on target mission. Time of firing, 14 hours 29 minutes and 18 seconds. The FDC for Battalion 2 issues its command, time on target mission. Time of firing, 14 hours 29 minutes and 29 seconds. The FDC for Battalion 3 issues its command, time on target mission. Time of firing, 14 hours 29 minutes and 24 seconds. In the gun pits of each battalion, the crews load their howitzers. The gun captains stand by their pieces, watches in hand. The section chief holds the lanyard, ready to fire. They wait. In the pit for Battalion 1, the second hand sweeps up. Fire! The gun fires at precisely 14 hours 29 minutes and 18 seconds. 6 seconds later, Battalion 3 fires. 5 seconds after that, Battalion 2 fires. The 54 shells are now in the air, on different trajectories, at different speeds, having been fired at 3 different moments. Now, consider the German soldier in the village square. It is 14 hours 29 minutes and 59 seconds. He hears nothing. There is no warning whistle. In WI, the whistle of an incoming shell was the sound of 1 shell. The sound of a taut mission is silence, followed by the universe-ending dot at 14 hours 30 minutes and 0 seconds. All 54 shells each, weighing 33 pounds, arrive at the exact same instant. The result is not an explosion. It is a concussion. The simultaneous detonation of nearly 1 ton of high explosives obliterates the target square. For the soldier on the ground, there is no first shell. There is no time to react. The surprise is total. The destruction absolute dot. This was the tactic. But it could be scaled. The FDC system was so flexible that it didn't just have to be 105 millimeters howitzers. The FDC could calculate the TOF for 155 millimeters howitzers and 155 millimeters long tom guns as well. A corps level TOT could involve hundreds of guns of different calibers spread out over 20 miles of front, all landing their shells on a single map coordinate at the same second. This was the instant thunder. It was a tactic that was psychologically shattering. German reports are filled with awe and terror at this capability. They had no counter for it. A normal barrage, you could hunker down and wait for it to pass. A TOT mission was the entire barrage in the first second. It didn't prepare the battlefield. It erased a grid square dot. This system required an incredible investment in training. The thousands of FDC specialists, forward observers, and radio operators were, in many ways, the unsung heroes of the Queen of Battle. They were mathematical warriors. The curriculum at Fort Sill was brutal. If you couldn't master the trigonometry, the logarithms, and the pressure of performing complex calculations while under simulated fire, you were dropped. The British had a similar concept, the stonk, but the American system with its standardized FDCs, plotting boards, and radio networks, was far more flexible, responsive, and scalable. The Soviet system achieved mass fire by physically massing thousands of guns wheel to wheel and firing them all at once, a terrifying but unsubtle and logistically backbreaking approach. The American system could achieve the same effect with guns that were dispersed, hidden, and miles apart. It was mass fire without massing. It was precision and brute force, unified by mathematics. This was the weapon that General Omar Bradley would inherit. It was a weapon of unparalleled lethality, a system perfectly designed to support the kind of breakout warfare he would need to conduct in Normandy. The system was blooded in North Africa and refined in Sicily. But it would be in the fields of France, in operations like Cobra, that time on target would truly come of age and overwhelm a German army that had no answer for it. The American entry into the land war began with Operation Torch in November 1942. The initial landings were against variable French resistance. But the real test came in early 1943 in the rugged hills of Tunisia. The campaign was, initially, a disaster. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, inexperienced and poorly led American troops were routed by the combined armor and artillery of Rommel's Afrika Korps. The after-action reports from Kasserine are a litany of failures. And the artillery was not immune. The core problem was not the guns or the FDCs. It was the doctrine of their use. General Lloyd Fredendall, the 2nd Corps commander, had dispersed his forces, including his artillery, in penny packets. Batteries were strung out, unable to support each other. Forward observers were often in the wrong place, unable to see the rapidly moving German armor. Communications wire was cut, and radio discipline was poor. The Germans used their 88mm guns in a direct-fire, anti-tank role with devastating effect, picking off American tanks and gun positions at ranges where the U.S. 105mm howitzers, designed for indirect fire, could not effectively reply. Kasserine was a humiliation, but it was also a vital, bloody lesson. It proved that the finest artillery system in the world was useless if not commanded correctly. In the wake of the defeat, General Marshall replaced Fredendall with a new commander, General George S. Patton, Jr., and under Patton came a new deputy corps commander, an unassuming Missourian named Omar Nelson Bradley. Bradley and Patton were polar opposites in personality, but they both recognized the failure at Kasserine. They immediately began to retrain and reorganize the 2nd Corps. Bradley, in particular, was a quiet proponent of the new artillery doctrine. He understood that its strength lay not in dispersal, but in centralization. The new American artillery doctrine received its first true validation just a few weeks later. At the Battle of El Getter in March 1943, the German 10th Panzer Division, fresh from its victory at Kasserine, launched a major assault. This time, the Americans were ready. The commander of the 1st Infantry Division's artillery, Brigadier General Terry Allen, had massed his guns. As the German tanks and infantry advanced, they were met not by scattered fire, but by the coordinated, overwhelming fire of multiple battalions. The FDCs, now battle-hardened, performed flawlessly. Forward observers, dug in on the high ground, called in targets. The eyes in the L4, Grasshopper Plains, overhead spotted the German columns long before they reached the American lines. At one point, a massed toddy mission from over 40 guns was called down on a German infantry concentration, shattering their attack. The Germans were stunned. Their own artillery, while excellent, could not match the responsiveness or volume of the American fire. The 10th Panzer Division, battered by the iron rain, withdrew. The line had held. El Getter was the first major American victory over German forces in the war, and it was, at its heart, an artillery victory, The lessons from North Africa were refined in the invasion of Sicily in July 1943. It was here that time on target was used with increasing frequency and devastating effect. The 93rd Armored Field Artillery Battalion is often credited with one of the first perfectly executed taut missions of the war, catching a German unit completely by surprise. In Sicily, the system was pushed to its limits. The mountainous terrain made laying wire impossible and observation difficult. A -300 Seychelles rupees radios and the L4 Air Op-S became the critical links. It was in Sicily that the famous artillery air team of the L4 pilot and the FDC truly came into its own. Pilots, circling over steep ravines, would spot a single German 88mm gun harassing an American advance. They would radio the coordinates. Minutes later, an entire battalion of 155mm howitzers, miles away and completely out of sight, would drop a taut mission on that single gun, obliterating it. This was a capability the Germans simply could not match. Omar Bradley, who commanded the 2nd Corps through the difficult Sicilian campaign, took meticulous note. He was not a flashy commander like Patton. He was an infantryman's general, and he saw that this new system of artillery was the best tool he had to save the lives of his infantrymen. He saw that by massing fire, he could destroy the enemy before his men had to close with bayonets. He saw the psychological effect of the way it paralyzed the enemy, broke their morale, and shattered their formations. When Bradley was selected by Eisenhower to command the American First Army for the invasion of France, he brought these lessons with him. He had seen the failure of dispersal at Kasserine and the triumph of massed fire at El Getter. He had seen the system, the FDC, the foe, and the air appât work under the most difficult conditions. He knew that the key to breaking out of the Normandy hedgerows would not be tanks alone. It would be a new, overwhelming application of firepower. The crucible of the Mediterranean had forged the weapon. In France, Bradley would finally get to wield it as a thunderbolt. By July 1944, the Allied invasion of Normandy was in peril. After the successful D-Day landings, the American, British, and Canadian armies had become bogged down in the bocage, the dense, ancient hedgerow country of Normandy. Each field was a small fortress, walled in by massive earthen banks. The German defenders, particularly the elite Panzerlehr and 2nd SS Das Reich divisions, were experts in this close-quarters defensive fighting. American progress was measured in yards, and the cost in lives was astronomical. General Omar Bradley, commanding the U.S. First Army, knew he had to achieve a breakout. He devised a plan, Operation Cobra, to shatter the German line on a narrow front and unleash his armored divisions into the open country beyond. But to create the whole, he would have to pulverize the most elite German division in Normandy, Panzerlehr. Bradley's plan for this was unprecedented. He decided to use all of the assets at his command, not sequentially, but simultaneously. Cobra would be preceded by the most concentrated application of firepower in the history of warfare. It was a three-part symphony of destruction. First, the fighter bombers would sweep the area. Second, a massive force of heavy bombers, strategic bombers, diverted from Germany, would lay down a carpet of bombs. And third, Bradley's own weapon, his massed field artillery, would complete the destruction and isolate the battlefield. It is the artillery component of Cobra that is often overlooked. But it was central to Bradley's instant thunder concept. While the bombers would provide the shock, the artillery would provide the precision and duration. The plan was complex. On July 25, 1944, over 2,500 Allied aircraft, including 1,500 B-17s and B-24s, were to saturate a 6,000 by 2,000 yard rectangle just south of the St. L. Perriers road. While the bombers attacked this main rectangle, Bradley's artillery had a different, more surgical job. Over 1,000 American field artillery pieces, from 105 mm howitzers to the massive 240 mm Black Dragon, guns were massed for the operation. Their FDCs were networked. Their air ops were already in the air. Their mission was twofold. First, they were to fire a massive counter-battery barrage. The FDCs and air ops had spent weeks meticulously identifying the locations of every known German artillery and mortar position. At the precise start of the operation, this vast arsenal of guns unleashed a simultaneous time-on-target mission, not on the German infantry, but on the German artillery. The goal was to silence the enemy's guns, to prevent them from interfering with the American ground assault. Second, the artillery was to box in the target area. While the bombers pounded the main rectangle, artillery batteries fired thousands of smoke shells and high explosive rounds on the flanks of the assault zone. This box barrage was designed to prevent German reinforcements from Panzer-Lehr or other units from moving in to counterattack. The German troops inside the box were being bombed. The German troops outside the box were being shelled. They were completely isolated. The bombing itself was terrifying, but tragically flawed. Due to navigation errors and smoke, several waves of bombers dropped their payloads short, on top of the waiting American infantry of the 30th and 9th Divisions. Hundreds of Americans were killed or wounded by their own bombs, including the highest-ranking American officer to be killed by friendly fire, Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, the very man who had built the modern U.S. Army. But for the Germans in the target box, the effect was apocalyptic. The commander of the Panzer-Lehr Division, Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein, described it in a post-war report. He wrote, "The carpet was laid. The planes flew over, wave after wave. The bomb racks opened and an uninterrupted rain of bombs fell on the strip. My front lines looked like the surface of the moon. All my tanks were knocked out, and my men were driven mad. When the smoke cleared, the American infantry and tanks advanced. They expected a hard fight. Instead, they found a lunar landscape. The German soldiers who survived were shell-shocked, wandering aimlessly, their will to fight completely vaporized. The Panzer-Lehr Division, the Wehrmacht's premier armored formation, had ceased to exist as a coherent, fighting force in the space of 2 hours. This was the instant thunder Bradley had envisioned. It was not just a time-on-target mission, but the philosophy of taut simultaneous, overwhelming, and shocking firepower applied on a strategic scale. The FDCs and the gun crews performed their role perfectly. The German artillery, hammered by the American counter-battery fire, was largely silent. The box barrage held the flanks. The result was a total breakthrough. Patton's new Third Army poured through the gap created by Cobra and fanned out across France. The war in the Bocage was over. The race to Paris had begun. Operation Cobra was a brutal, imperfect, and tragic operation. But it was also a stunning success. It validated the American doctrine of massed firepower. It proved that when the eyes, brains, and steel of the U.S. artillery system were combined with the heavy metal of the Army Air Corps, they could shatter the most elite an enemy had to offer. The Germans had been overwhelmed, not by tactical genius on the ground, but by a logistical and mathematical system of annihilation. The success of Operation Cobra was not an isolated event. It was the blueprint for American victory. For the rest of the war, from the breakout in France to the forests of the Ardennes and the final crossing of the Rhine, the U.S. Army's field artillery dominated the battlefield. It had achieved a level of flexibility, responsiveness, and lethality that no other army in the world could match. The Germans, who began the war as the masters of combined arms, were now on the receiving end of a superior system. Their own artillery was handicapped by a declining industrial base, a lack of fuel, and the total loss of air superiority. They could not move their guns without being spotted by an L-4 Grasshopper. They could not mass for a counterattack without an FDC miles away calculating their coordinates. German after-action reports and post-war interrogations are a testament to the dread they felt. They did not fear American tanks, which they considered inferior to their own Tigers and Panthers. They did not fear American infantry, which they respected but considered poor in close-quarters combat. They feared the American artillery. They called it Achtung-Artillerie, or extermination artillery. They wrote of the iron rain that fell with no warning. The Battle of the Bulge was perhaps the artillery's finest hour. When the Germans launched their surprise offensive in December 1944, they achieved total surprise. But as American units fell back, they formed islands of resistance, and the artillery was their backbone. At Bastogne, the surrounded 101st Airborne's artillery under General Anthony McAuliffe became a fortress. Their FDCs coordinated the fire of every gun, creating a ring of steel that shattered one German assault after another. It was also in the Ardennes that the proximity VT fuse was finally authorized for use on land. The effect was immediate and horrific. German Volksgrenadier divisions, massed for assaults in the open, were caught by waves of airbursting 105 mm and 155 mm shells. The shrapnel raining down from above was inescapable. Entire battalions were shredded in minutes. The Germans, unfamiliar with the technology, attributed the devastating airbursts to a new, terrifyingly accurate American ability. The key to this dominance was the system. A single American forward observer, a lieutenant with a radio, wielded more destructive power than a German battalion commander. That FIO could, with a short radio call, command the fire of his entire battalion's 12 guns. If the target was important, the battalion FDC could pass the mission to the divisional FDC, which could add all of the division's 72 guns. If the target was a Corps-level threat, like a Tiger tank battalion, the Corps' FDC could unleash a tot from over 200 guns of every caliber. This was known as the grid square system. The FDCs had pre-calculated the firing data for every single grid square on the operational map. An FOO, or an RAP, simply had to radio in a grid number and a time. Fire mission, grid 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Time on target, 8 hours, 30 minutes, and 0 seconds. At that exact second, hundreds of guns, all with that data preset, would fire. The designated grid square would simply cease to exist. This was the ultimate expression of instant thunder. It was an industrialized, mathematical, and networked form of warfare that the Germans could not comprehend, let alone counter. General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring, when asked what, decisively, beat the German army, had a one-word answer: artillery. The legacy of this system is profound. The U.S. Army's Fire Direction Center, the Forward Observer Network, and the doctrine of time on target were not just wartime expedients. They became the foundation of all Western artillery doctrine for the next 70 years. The math that was done on slide rules and plotting boards in 1944 is the same math that is done by digital ballistic computers in the M109 Paladin and the Hammer system today. The eyes, brains, and steel model is still the core of modern fire support. Omar Bradley's instant thunder was, in the end, a victory of systems. It was the triumph of the Fort Sill mathematician, the factory worker in Detroit, the radio operator in the dugout, and the pilot in the Grasshopper. Together, they created a machine of such speed and lethality that it overwhelmed an enemy who still believed that war was a matter of will. The American artillery of World War II proved that, in a modern war, it is also a matter of math.